Exciting. Um, my name is Sarah, and I'm the local extension educator here in Cook County. And my job is to bring University of Minnesota research and resources to our community and partner with local folks and organizations on lots of different things. And one area of my work involves supporting local food and agriculture in Cook County. So I'm excited to have a chance to get to talk about that. I've never given this talk before, and it was fun to put together and think about how to frame things today. So I wanted to start out with just zooming out a little bit and thinking about why food is such a cool lens to think about our community through. And food is really connected to all kinds of different ways that we can think about our lives and our community. Of course, it's connected to health. We hear all the time about how chronic diseases and overall community health are tied to our diets and the food that we eat. Food, of course, is connected to the land. The ways that we grow our food and harvest and produce our food has huge impacts on the environment, locally and globally. It's connected to our economy. Food is a huge business, and where and how we buy our food impacts the economy both locally and globally. And of course, I was just at the grocery store this morning, gulping at the prices. Every day we see news stories about inflation and the cost of food and how it's impacting people's lives. It's tied to climate change. Agriculture and the food industry has huge impacts on the future of climate change. Food is tied to policy, laws and regulations that govern our food system and how we're allowed to produce food or not. And food safety is a huge, huge concern as well. Food is also tied to education. We're taught all the time, both in on purpose ways and sort of informal ways about what food we should want to eat, what food makes us healthy or not, what food is good for us or not, those sorts of things. And food, of course, is tied to our cultures too. What we eat, how we cook, what we prefer to eat, what keeps us healthy is tied to culture. And food is a huge equity issue too. We live in a super wealthy nation, and we have tons of people who aren't able to afford and find and cook the food that's going to keep them going day to day. So food can just have this massive, there's all these tendrils that connect to all different parts of our lives. And I think it's also cool to think about food as a system. This graphic comes from a food assessment that was done out in Somerville, Massachusetts. And I think it's cool to see the different big components. So it showed food connected to the production of food, processing, distribution, access, consumption, and recovery or waste. And then it shows all these little sort of issue areas connected to each of those big chunks of the food system. And we'll think about some of those as we go through today's talk about Cook County specifically. So I wanted to start out looking to the past, and then we'll talk a bit about the present, and then we'll look a little into the future. And when we look to the past in Cook County, I think it's important to look way back and think about how people lived before settlement and colonization in this landscape. And of course, the Ojibwe Anishinaabe people have been living in this area and on this land for many thousands of years. And prior to colonization, they provided all the food that they needed to eat through seasonal food practices that include maple sugaring in the spring, harvesting edible plants, berries, seeds, and more in the summertime, gardening in the summer, wild ricing in the fall, and of course, fishing and hunting throughout the year. And for Ojibwe people and culture, food and health and medicine are all very entwined concepts. And maintaining these food practices is really important to the continued food sovereignty and food security of Graham Portage, band members, and descendants living in this area. And of course, we know as well that access to land to be able to continue these food traditions has become more and more limited over time. Right here in Cook County, we can especially look back to the Treaty of 1854, which established the reservation and began that limiting of access to the ability to continue that way of life. And though that knowledge of traditional food practices has been interrupted through many injustices that have occurred since the 1800s up until the present, including things like tearing apart families by sending children to boarding schools, pushback against the rights that were enshrined in treaties with tribes, discrimination and all, there's still these traditions that are alive and being shared within the communities of our Native neighbors. And there's a lot of interest in revitalizing culture and health and all of that through food sovereignty, which we'll talk more about in the present and future too. So like I mentioned, that Treaty of 1854 is what ceded a huge territory of land to the US government and created the reservation up here. But there were some other policies passed in the late 1800s that also had a huge impact on our local food system. The Homestead Act of 1862 is what encouraged non-native settlers to move to this area. And they were able to be given land for free if they lived on it and farmed on it or built a structure on it for 5 years. There was also an act in 1887 called the Dawes Act that allowed the government to break up the reservations into parcels and give each individual person a parcel of land instead of allowing the land to be held in a shared way. And that act really changed land use on the reservations too, because it allowed non-native settlers to then move in and claim homesteads in what used to be these big reservation areas. And so the North Shore and Cook County saw a huge population growth of settlers following these policies, many of whom came here from other places to fish and to farm. We saw a big fishing industry begin along the North Shore in that time, as well as people trying their hand at farming. The picture on the screen right now is from the Cook County Historical Society, and it shows the Alfred Nelson Fish House down in Lutsen. I found a few photos from the Historical Society that I thought were fun to share. This is a postcard that is from 1910, and the text is too small for you to read, but it's hilarious. It's from somebody whose last name is Green in Hovland in 1910, and it's written to the farmers of St. Paul, Minnesota, and it's encouraging everyone to come on up here to Cook County to farm, because as they say, there is no poor soil, and there's plenty of timber. And you'll just have such good luck if you come up here and start your farm. And I think that many people met a much harsher reality when they moved here to start farms than this postcard describes. A couple of other photos. This one shows the Hedstrom House and Farm on Central Maple Hill. And this shows the Fredenberg Hay Farm. So I think there's a lot more interesting research that could be done about these homesteaders and the farming history of Cook County. This map was started by the Extension Office a few years ago by my predecessor, Diane Booth, where she was trying to map out all of the different homestead farm sites in the county from the 1930 census data. And it didn't get finished. So this doesn't show every single farm site, but it's kind of cool to see where those sites were. And I think it's part of that story of our food system from the late 1800s to today. Cook County has gradually lost most of its farms for a complex set of reasons, some having to do with, tourism becoming the main economy of this region, others having to do with changes in our food system, both nationally and globally, that have really decreased the profitability of small farms in favor of bigger, more consolidated farming practices that just are not possible in the region that we're living in. So that brings us a little closer to the present. We'll talk a bit now about what's the story of local food in Cook County today. About 10 years ago, there was a survey done by a local nonprofit called the Northwoods Food Project in partnership with the Extension Office. And they wanted to ask some questions. How large of an industry is food in Cook County? How much of that industry is locally grown, raised, or harvested food? And what's the potential for local food in our community? They determined through their research that of all sales, so they were using sales tax data in 2013 in Cook County, 38% of those gross sales were related to food, either retail food like a grocery store purchases or food service like a restaurant. And they also surveyed businesses who sell food, and they surveyed local producers. And they found from the businesses that they were purchasing back then, about 10 years ago, an estimated $20.8 million of local food that year, or not of local food, of all food that year. And they were purchasing some local foods, but a really tiny proportion of their total purchasing was coming from local foods. And they wanted to be able to purchase more local food, those businesses did, but they perceived a lot of barriers to that. And that's what you see in the graph here on the screen. They were worried that the producers couldn't produce enough of what they needed at the right times of year, concerned about the price of local food compared to what they could get elsewhere. There are products they want that simply weren't available, a lack of infrastructure for getting that local food to their businesses, various regulatory agencies, issues and quality concerns. And then on the flip side, when they surveyed local producers, they found that there is local food, of course, being produced, but there are a lot of concerns from local producers too about barriers they have to being able to produce more local food or to be able to sell the food in the way that they want to. Those barriers are shown in this other graph. And if you look, it's kind of the flip of the first one. So at the bottom is the highest concern was how little land suitable for farming is available here, and how expensive that land is, how hard it is to start as a farmer in Cook County. They're also concerned about competition, the seasonality, low demand, all kinds of things. So again, this was done 10 years ago, and the survey generated a ton of great information about kind of the local landscape for food in Cook County. And now 10 years later, we've definitely seen some growth in the local food economy, but a lot of these same barriers, I would say if we did this survey again today, we would probably see really similar results of what both producers and businesses are saying. So what local food is being produced in Cook County? There is a lot going on. Everything from all kinds of vegetables being grown on produce farms, fruits. There are people producing eggs from ducks, quails, and chickens. I know of people selling fish, bison, beef, pork, chicken, and of course, maple syrup. Maple syrup makes up a big portion of actually the sales of local food coming from Cook County. And how are local producers selling that food? One way is through community-supported agriculture systems, which is where families pay a farmer up front at the beginning of the season, and then they get a box of produce weekly throughout that growing season. There's also farmers markets going on. There are producers who are selling their products directly to local schools. The school we're in right now has a grant from the state of Minnesota right now to purchase local food. So they're able to buy that and serve it in the school cafeteria. There's definitely a market for restaurants interested in using local ingredients, and some of our producers are selling to our local restaurants. You'll also be able to find some of our local products in grocery stores, the co-op, and in other kinds of institutions like senior nutrition programs, things like that. There's a survey that's done every 5 years by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. It's called the Census of Agriculture. And the results from 2022 just came out a couple of months ago. It takes them a long time to tabulate all of this information. And I think this is one helpful way to think about what's going on, but we also have to take it with a big grain of salt, because we know for sure that lots of smaller farms and smaller producers don't fill out this survey because it's very extensive. You have to be keeping a lot of really detailed records. And so a lot of them just don't see it as worth their time to do. So that said, it does give us some interesting information about what sort of is happening in the local food scene in Cook County. I think the last statistic on the screen there is sort of the funniest one. Of course, we're ranked 86 out of 87 counties in Minnesota for the amount of agricultural products that are sold from Cook County. But of the farms that filled it out, it's also interesting that the land use that they recorded was primarily woodland types of farms, which makes me think mostly it's our maple syrup producers who've been filling out this survey. And we had 25 farms fill out the survey in Cook County, which is even more than I don't think I could name 25 farms. So that's cool to know that there's a lot going on out there. Another important thing going on in our community that we don't have a way to quantify right now is there's such a significant amount of people producing food for their own families in Cook County. I kind of think of it as like a Venn diagram of there's like people doing commercial agriculture, and there's sort of this homesteading, backyard farming sort of scene, and they overlap, but they're not the same people all the time. And there's huge interest in our community in that sort of hobby farming, homesteading sort of way of producing food. And I imagine that there's a great deal of that food being given to family and friends and neighbors that's not being captured in any of this sort of economic analysis of local food in our community. But it would be really interesting to study more. Could we find out, what percent of households are producing what percent of their own food in a given year? Could we find out how much is being informally traded and given around in the community? That would be an area for potential future research. Next, I'm going to talk about 2 local projects that are highlighting local food system efforts. One is the tribal food sovereignty efforts going on in Grand Portage that are super cool. And indigenous food sovereignty is the concept of tribal nations and communities being able to feed their own community, their own people on their own terms. And Grand Portage has had this CASH, that's what the acronym, you say it as CASH, Community Agriculture Through Culture, Health, and Education program for many years now. And they've started a number of super initiatives on the reservation, including the Grand Portage Community Garden, which has both plots for individual families to produce food and communal food being grown that then gets given out at a weekly food market, like a farmer's market, but more donation-based. People can come and access that food as they need it. You've probably also heard all the news recently about the Bison Project going on in Grand Portage, which is bringing a potential meat source to the community. They have a deep winter greenhouse, which is a really innovative way of being able to produce mostly lettuces and greens and things in some of the really cold months of the year. I was up there a month ago and there was beautiful chard and bok choy and some lettuces being grown right now when it's super cold outside. So that was cool. They also have a lot of community events and nutrition education happening as part of this project, and programs for youth and elders to revitalize and learn those cultural food traditions. The other project I wanted to highlight is that local nonprofit called the Northwoods Food Project. And they're working really hard to connect and grow and support this sustainable local food system in Cook County. They've been around for about 2 decades now. And some of the projects that they've worked on are starting community gardens. There are now 3 community gardens in Grand Marais, one that's being built in Tofte and one in Grand Portage. And if you combine all the plots available for families in all of those, there are more than 100 community garden plots in Cook County, which is a lot of families growing a lot of food when you think about it. The food project also started the Grand Marais Farmers Market, which happens on Thursdays in the parking lot at the Cook County Community Center from June to October. Last summer, the farmers market had 14 vendors, which is an all-time high, and it's all people selling food that they've grown, produced, or created here locally. The food project also supports local food production by trying to connect people who want to get started in producing local food with mentorship, other resources, access to land, that sort of thing. And one of their emerging projects is thinking about creating a shared food processing equipment library that would allow farmers and home producers to be able to access tools and equipment that would help them preserve food or prepare food or change its form in some way so that it can be sold or stored longer through the year. And now let's look just a little bit to the future of our local food system. Are there ways we could grow what's happening in Cook County? I'm probably preaching to the choir on what the benefits of the local food system are, but I just want to highlight some of them. When we're able to access local foods, those foods are often fresher. We're eating more in season. When that food has less time from when it's picked to when you eat it, the nutrients in it are actually higher. So it is actually healthier food for us to be able to eat. Of course, when we spend our dollars with local food producers, that money is circulating back in our local economy and help support our local economy and diversify it away from just tourism into more areas. There's also benefits to the environment. Local food tends to be produced in a more sustainable manner than food that's coming from some of those big consolidated farms that we might find elsewhere. And also it's proven that the fewer steps there are in the supply chain between that food being picked and you eating it, the higher the likelihood that food is going to be safe, free from possible foodborne illness, that sort of thing. And there's huge opportunity to create community and social connection between producers, growers, and consumers. There was another study done about a decade ago that was studying the local food economy in the taconite assistance area, which includes Cook County. It's basically the whole Iron Range and North Shore area. And in that study, they showed, in that study, they showed that there is currently 0.5% of household and food service spending being spent on local food in our region. So 0.5 of 1% of all the spending on food is on local food. And they did some analysis to suggest if our region could move that needle up to 20% local food being purchased, $51 million would be kept in the region, promoting the growth of our local economies. And they studied two different diet scenarios of the region. One was the standard American diet, which of course acronyms to SAD. The other one was the range healthy diet. So they were saying, if we could change collectively our community's eating habits to have less meat, eat more fruits and vegetables and more legumes, which of course we all know would be healthy for us on a public health level too. They said, if we could shift to that diet, based on their analysis, 100% of that diet could be produced locally to feed this region. And that this region, if you're not looking just at Cook County, but that whole taconite assistance area actually has enough agricultural land available that could produce this food to feed our region. And of course, increasing local food production would increase local jobs in the area too, diversify our economies, that sorts of things. There were some key recommendations they came out with from that report. Some of them were around finding assistance for people to begin farming and improve their farming capacity, researching more models for distribution of local food, and supporting education and assistance for local producers. There's a few innovative ideas that I wanted to just sort of pitch for us all to think about as well, that are happening in other parts of Minnesota and around the country as well. One that's really cool is this concept of a food hub. A food hub is where multiple producers are bringing their products together, and they're being aggregated and then sold to entities that need to be able to purchase a larger quantity than any one producer could do alone. This is happening a lot with farmers markets, farm to school programs and other programs like that, where there are lots of small farmers who might all have, a couple boxes of tomatoes, and it would just be too hard for those individual farmers to develop those relationships and all the logistics and systems that are involved in being able to sell to those larger customers. But if they're able to aggregate their food together and there's some middle person there, the food hub, who can help promote and get that food to market, that they're able to really change the game for how much local food is happening in a community. Another thing that we could think about in our community is what capacity we have for food processing and storage. I mentioned that local idea about the food processing equipment library. Similarly, we're really far from the nearest place that you can process meat that's going to be inspected by the USDA or be able to be sold in a grocery store or retail sort of setting. And so what could we do? How could we reimagine or be able to create ways for people to process meat locally that could then be sold? There's also a lot more that farmers can do with their produce and still sell it under what's called product of the farm, which is exempt from licensing than sometimes people realize. So you can change the form of the food that you pick from the field by cutting it up, freezing it, drying it, dehydrating it, steam blanching it. As long as you're not adding ingredients that you didn't grow on your farm, you can do a lot of things to that food and still be able to sell it that might allow you to sell it into a bigger season. Because of course, our short growing season is one of our biggest limiting factors. So anything we can think about that might expand the edges of that for farmers to be able to get more of their food into the community are worth us talking about. There's a number of programs already going on through our local farmers market to increase, sort of meet in that middle, the idea of local food and food access or food security for people who might be struggling to afford food. A couple of them are on the left-hand side of the screen here that I'll just mention briefly, and then we can think about some future ones too. The Power of Produce Club is where kids can come to the farmers market in the summer, and each week that they come, they get $5 to spend on fresh produce. It brings families to the market because those kids are excited to be part of the club. It promotes healthy eating, promotes access to the farmers market, and it increases the sales for farmers and encourages them to expand and grow more in future years. Market Bucks is a program through the state of Minnesota that's connected to SNAP. SNAP is what was formerly called food stamps, and lots of community members are using SNAP to buy their food at the grocery store. You can also use it to buy food at the farmer's market. And when someone comes with their SNAP card and they swipe their card at the welcome booth of the market for $10 of their SNAP benefit, it gets matched by the state of Minnesota. So they actually get $20 additional to spend at the farmer's market. So when someone comes to the market and wants to use their SNAP, it triples their buying power at the market and has huge positive benefits for the vendors at the market as well. And together we grow as a similar program for people who are participating in WIC, the Women, Infants, and Children's program, which promotes nutrition as well. But there are other ones that we're not doing yet or that we could expand on in our community. VeggieRx is this really innovative idea where people get a prescription for vegetables from their clinic or healthcare provider, and then they get basically a CSA share, either that they pick up at a particular site or gets delivered to them at home. So it's that idea of like, how can we promote health and support a local food economy upstream, as opposed to waiting till people are sick and in poor health from not having access to fresh fruits and vegetables later on. There's tons of effort going on around farm to various ways people are accessing food that are different than a grocery store and cooking at home. So farm to school, how can we get more local food into schools? How can we get local food into childcare centers and early care settings? Similarly, other institutions like Meals on Wheels, senior nutrition programs, hospitals, all sorts of institutions. And a lot of those involve grant funding or some type of middleman that allows those institutions to visualize how they could get that food and make that happen, as opposed to them having to take that first step by themselves. There's also tons of really cool programs getting local food into food shelves and other sort of food assistance programs. Down in Duluth, there's a group that just sources donations from the community, and then they buy, I think, 10 to 20 CSA shares that just go to the food shelf every week throughout the summer. Wouldn't it be cool to replicate something like that in Cook County? So I just wanted to finish by posing the question to everyone of, what is your role in the local food system, and what do you think your role could be? We all have to eat, and so we all have a potential role to play, either as a producer, a consumer, a supporter of other local producers. Maybe you want to start a garden in your own backyard, or maybe your mode in is through thinking about policy. How could we shift policies to promote local food in our community? There's really a place for everyone at the table. And with that, I just want to say thank you and open up for any questions folks have.
I can't help myself. We're 86 out of 87 on that survey.
Yeah. I didn't look. I would have to pull up every county's profile and see which one was 87. I don't know. I don't even have a guess, actually. Yeah. Sorry. Yes.
You don't know of any experiments that are trying to assess new vegetables and fruits that they grow here in climate change, and I have sort of a vested interest in discussing this because when I put in a peach tree or some of the community orchard, that was the idea. But to see if peaches and the plums and the cherries and the strawberries and
Yeah.
they do.
Yeah.
And but now it's changes, more variety, and certainly there might be other vegetables that could be grown up here.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the growing zone maps that are put out, how when you shop for plants, you'll see it's listed as which zone it can thrive in. Typically, we're just updated for the first time in 10 years. And so some of the zones in our area did change, but only by a half a letter. So you know how it's like zone 5A to B or 3A to B or that sort of thing. So basically some areas got a little bit warmer, which means that you could start trying some additional plants that might only thrive in slightly warmer conditions. But the other problem with climate change is that it's not just that it's getting warmer, but the weather gets a lot more volatile. So we see more of these sort of extreme weather events that can be really challenging for agriculture. And there is a lot of work being done through Extension in the U to help farmers build more resilience into their farm system for climate change and think about some of those effects of climate change that might impact them, such as longer drought periods, heavier rainfall events, and how to plan for some of that stuff. But as to like specific research in Cook County on varieties that might be able to be grown in the future, I don't know of any research projects on that right now, but the Master Gardener volunteers are doing a variety trial project this year where they're growing out specific varieties to see how well they grow. In vegetables, yeah. And so there could be future research in that area too. Yeah, yeah. Sweet. Well, thanks, everybody. I'll hang out if you want to come up and ask another question. Yeah. Yeah.